Welcome. So we will continue our discussion on building models of receptive fields of neurons, of sensory neurons particularly. So the problem that we are faced with is that we have a stimulus S, and it is being transformed to a response R, and the stimulus could be parameterized by physical parameters, some a vector theta, and response could be based a vector also with a certain resolution of time and as a function of time. So how is the stimulus related to the response, or how is the stimulus encoded in the response, is one side of the problem. And similarly, the other side of the problem is, given a response, can we predict the stimulus, or can we find out what stimulus was played? And it can be for other things as well, not necessarily a stimulus. As we have said, it could be other phenomena that is going on at the time of the responses, or at the time of the activity that we are observing. So this backward problem, or the decoding problem, can be approached in a number of ways, and the encoding problem also can be approached in a number of ways. And the most simple way in which we can look at the stimulus response relationship going from S to R is by using simple linear models, or linear time invariant models. So if we recollect how we have looked at the how we have developed the idea of spiking by neurons, we can actually say that we have sort of a box from the stimulus world. Let us say we have xt as the stimulus, and ultimately what we are observing is a set of spike trains, or a set of spikes as a spike train. So this we will write as pt, or we will essentially write this as a sum of impulses, that is delta t's minus ti's. So where I is varying from 1 to capital N t. That is what we are saying. What delta t minus ti is the Dirac delta function. We will go into details of it in a little bit. We are representing each spike at time ti with this sum. So if there is a time window capital T here, and we are saying that there are capital N suffix capital T spikes, and each of those spikes are occurring at time point ti, then this is the representation of pt, that is the response. Now in here what is going on is a very big question, but for us we will try to do this, that how well can we describe this black box in such that given new xt's, how well can we predict the response pt's. And so in order to build these ideas, in order to get to the stage where we will be defining models within that box, or understanding what is going on within that box, we need to take a little bit of background even for the linear models. So the ideas that we will be using is what we call is linear time invariant systems. So, as the words suggest, linear, we sort of gave you an idea what linear is. We will define it properly. Time invariant simply means that the system itself is not changing with time, which is not true for neurons, as we have seen that there is short term depression, short term plasticity, as well as long term changes and dependence of spikes due to refractory and so on. It is not a time invariant system. However, we may be able to approximate it at a particular situation as a time invariant system. And what we will see is that these kind of linear time invariant like descriptions of neurons actually works well, especially when we are considering neurons in the periphery, that is, as we have discussed, in the lateral geniculate nucleus, or in the retinal ganglion cell responses, or in the auditory nerve, or in the cochlear nucleus. Certain types of neurons in the cochlear nucleus can be well described by the linear time invariant system. Although in the true sense they aren't linear time invariant systems. So, another reason why we want to use this kind of system approach is that we can always approximate a system as a linear system over a small region of parameter space, as we have done in the nonlinear phase plane analysis. We looked at the linearization around the equilibrium points. This also similarly can be thought of linearization around a particular point in the parameter space, and that description can be a linear time invariant system that will be sufficient. And as we change that baseline point in the parameter space, we will have different descriptions of the system. So, that is another way to conclude that the linear time invariant system approach is actually useful, even though the entire neuron is not necessarily so. Further, probably the most important idea is that even though we have all these problems with these approaches, if we consider the changes in a system. So, let us say we described a neuron with a linear time invariant system approach in the initial stages. Let us say there is some perturbation or learning or something in the system, and the neuron changes its properties, and then we describe the system with this linear time invariant system approach. And we see that whatever we can conclude from this approach before the perturbation or learning and after the perturbation, there will be many pointers that will be available in terms of the mechanism by which the system changed from the one initially, which was approximated by that linear system, to the new linear system. So, the way the linear part of the system is changing, that itself is very instructive in order to understand what underlying mechanisms may be going on that produce that change. So, we will also discuss at a point of time examples of this, where this approach tells us about the underlying changes in a system that is actually learning something during behavior. So, with that sort of background on why we want to study linear time invariant systems to describe neurons, I hope you are convinced that even though neurons are very nonlinear, I mean very nonlinear is not a very good term, although neurons are nonlinear, still we want to use such approaches. So, now to formally say what is a linear system. So, first of all, let us say what is a system. System is essentially what we drew in the previous slide, that this is our system that takes an input and produces an output, xt as input and output is pt. So, if we say that this xt is the input, we have a system S, or and the output is yt for now, is easier to say. Then the system S is called a linear system if for an input x1t the system produces an output y1t, and if for an input x2t the system produces an output y2t, then if the system is given the input a scalar times x1t plus another scalar times x2t as the input, the output can be said to be a y1t plus b y2t. So, this is what we call the superposition principle. And if a system follows this superposition principle, we say that it is a linear system. So, like the example that I was giving in an earlier lecture, that orientation tuning of a neuron, that if we have one bar and response we know, and another bars, horizontal bars response we know, then if we have these two together, then the sum of the responses is the response when we have the two together. That is essentially what superposition principle says. And what time invariant means is that if I have an input xt for the system S and there is an output yt, then if we shift the input by time tau, then the output is also shifted by time tau and for any tau. So, this is time invariance. That is essentially, if I give an input now and measure the output now, and an hour later I give the same input, I should get the same output. That is, our xt translated by 1 hour, it produces yt also translated by 1 hour. So, that is what we mean by time invariance. And a system that follows both superposition principle and time invariance is what we call an LTI system, or linear time invariant system. Now, the advantage of an LTI is that we can completely describe the system. If, let us say, the system S is now an LTI, then if we have an input xt, we can always find out what yt is if we know some particular property of the system, which we call the impulse response. That is, when xt is delta t, that is the Dirac delta function that we had said, then the output yt that we measure, let us say it is ht. So, for input delta t we are getting an output ht. So, if we know this ht, for an LTI we can show that for any given xt as input to the system, we can find out what the output yt is going to be, and that is integral minus infinity to infinity x tau h t minus tau d tau. This is also called the convolution of xt and xt and ht. So this integral is the representation of the convolution. So why we can get that? It follows simply from the linear time invariance property and the fact that the Dirac delta function can be used to represent any signal xt or scaled and shifted versions of delta functions added together can be used to represent any stimulus xt. And since the system is LTI or linear time invariant and we know the output for delta t, which is ht, we know the output for any xt because xt is simply scaled and shifted versions of delta t. And linear time invariance says that we can simply sum up the responses to get the sum up the do the scaled and shifted sum of the responses in the same manner and get the overall output. So to define delta t, let us say we have been saying this Dirac delta function. So this will come up later on also. The delta t can be defined in this manner. It is an impulse. Many of you may already know this delta t is that it is actually 0 for all t not equal to 0 and it is not 0 for t equal to 0 and integral of delta t dt over minus infinity to infinity is 1. There are many properties of this delta t that will come into use is that if we multiply delta t with some other xt and integrate this over the interval, let us say minus infinity to infinity, this simply means that it is an evaluation of xt at wherever this delta is, wherever this t is 0. So it is essentially x0. And if we shift it, if it is t minus tau, then it is an evaluation of xt at tau. So these things will come up in our later lectures when we talk about how to analyze these linear time invariant systems. So having said all these things, it is essential that to describe an LTI, we need to be able to find out this HT or the impulse response. So if we can somehow measure or find out what the HT is, we are done describing the system. So how do we describe or find out HT? So and how do we bring it into the overall picture of stimulus to response scenario for a neuron? So as we had been saying, let us say this is the stimulus xt and we had this big box and we have this output pt, and remember that pt is this summation of delta t minus ti at for I is equal to 1 to capital N-T, that is there are capital N suffix capital T number of spikes in capital T time window for which the response for which the stimulus is on, that is xt is played. We cannot say that this itself is the LTI, or we cannot approximate this as the LTI, because from xt, from any xt being able with an with the impulse response, it will not be possible to generate impulses in this case given a smooth kind of xt. So Now we bring into the picture what we have learned about the neuron so far. So we said that we can represent the response by a rate as a function of time or lambda as a function of time, and that lambda t or RT is the driving function for an inhomogeneous Poisson process. Or the point process that the spike train is, and these events are represented by the delta t's. So lambda t essentially is saying that the average rate at a particular instant t, that based on many repetitions, the spiking events in that instant t and a delta window around it, that the probability of spikes occurring in that window is proportional to this lambda t, provided that there is only one spike possible in that window. So what we can approximate the system by is, so lambda t is the driving function. So let us say we have somehow get a lambda t that serves as an input to a point process generator that is producing the spike train Pt. So I am starting from the back end of it. So we know that Pt is a set of events successively occurring in time, and lambda t is the overall driving function which is creating those events over time, and that this process is an inhomogeneous Poisson process, that is a lambda that is changing over time. So what is it that is actually driving the neuron to produce spikes at a particular window? It is its membrane potential. When it crosses a threshold, then there is a spike. The higher it crosses the threshold, the longer it will take to come back down, and so there will be a larger period of time over which there will be high probability of spiking. That is, if we repeat it from over and over again with some additional noise, and so we can represent this lambda t to be generated by the membrane potential of the neuron. So as a proxy for lambda t, we may now think of it in this way, that if we have the membrane potential somehow coming into this box that produces lambda t, then this box would need to have a function that is converting, let us say this is yt, that is converting this yt into lambda t. And how so? The first step is that there is a threshold. So let us say our yt is here and lambda t is here. So the rate is 0 up to the threshold membrane potential. So there must be a threshold, and after that there is an increase in firing rate or the probability of spiking as the membrane potential is larger and larger. And we also know that there is an upper limit to this firing because of relative refractory and absolute refractory, and also naturally there are other limits to the number of spikes a neuron can produce in terms of the ion channels that are present and so on. And so there must be some sort of a saturation, and an often used function is like this, that has a threshold that saturates, or a sigmoid like function or something like this, that is the transformation from yt to lambda t. However, it is not necessary that it is always going to be like the figure that I have drawn. There may be cases where this function is something like this, or there may be cases where this function is simply like this, straight going up to a certain range and is undefined beyond that, and so on. There are many possibilities. So, and that depends on maybe other inhibitory inputs that are there and so on. So, in general, we can think of this yt to lambda t transformation as a static nonlinearity. That is, we plug in y into that function and get out lambda from that function, and that is a nonlinear function. So, let us say that we represent this by a nonlinear function that is producing lambda as a function of y, or we can call this maybe some nonlinear function st. Now, the question is whether before yt the transformation from xt to the membrane potential yt, can we represent that as a linear time invariant system? So, this here is preceded by a box which we are assuming to be a linear time invariant system that takes xt as input and convolves it with the impulse response, which, let us say, produces something that is akin to the membrane potential of the neuron, which is then passing through a static nonlinearity, which is generating the probability of spikes, that is the rate of spikes lambda t, which is driving the point process. So, this is the setup of the problem in the sense that if we were to approximate the transformation of the stimulus up to the neuron that we are recording from its membrane potential, that entire chain of events with a linear time invariant system. So, obviously that it is not a very good, I mean it will appear to be not a very good assumption, but as I said, we will also see that many neurons can be well described by this HT, and for the other reasons that we have mentioned, these kind of models are useful. So, now we are left with the task, if we want to find out what PT is going to be given any xt, we need to be able to find this nonlinear function actually, and HT. Actually, if we know HT, that nonlinear function can be easily estimated from the available observations. So, this whole problem boils down to finding HT. Since it is a linear time invariant system, we know that if we know the impulse response, then we know everything there is to that LTI. So, if we can somehow, given some xt, we know what the PTs are, from these observations can somehow find out what this HT is going to be is, then we will be done with creating this model. So, that we will see is will essentially be what we call the spike triggered average, and that will require our ideas of autocorrelation function and cross correlation functions that we have introduced, and we can show that indeed we can, in spite of this nonlinearity present, arbitrary nonlinearity present, we can indeed model this system with an HT. So, we will take up that in our next lecture. Thank you.